Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session all about work-life harmony. I'm Richard MacKinnon, and I'm going to be facilitating this session. I'm delighted to see some familiar names, but if this is the first of the sessions that you've joined, you're very welcome. Let me cover off a few brief points of housekeeping before we go any further. First of all, the session is being recorded, and the recording is going to be made available shortly on our YouTube channel. And I'd encourage you all to visit the channel to have another look at this and carve out some time for yourself to review the principles we'll be talking about and the key takeaways for you. The one thing I can definitely promise you is that a relatively brief daytime webinar on work-life harmony is not going to instantly lead to work-life harmony. So take some time out to think about what this means for you and the changes that you'd like to make as a result of that. Please do ask your questions as we go through. We've chat functionality. There's a chat box and there's Q&A, and I'll keep my eye on both of those. And as I spot the questions appearing, I'll do my very best to answer them in a timely way. But I want to give you pause for thought as we go through it as well. So please do take a moment to think about the questions I'm posing to you. Make some notes if you find that useful, and come back and revisit this once it's live on YouTube. A little bit about me, if you haven't joined us before. I'm a chartered psychologist, a workplace psychologist. I focus on people development across three broad themes: helping people with their well-being, helping them with their productivity, and with their professional effectiveness at work. And that's achieved through one-to-one coaching, provision of training courses, and more joined up longer-term development programs. And I and the WorkLifePsych team work globally. And WorkLifePsych is the business I founded about 6 years ago. You can find out all about us and what we do at worklifepsych.com. I'm keen to move into the real meat of why we're here today. The webinars are a series we've been running in 2020. There was a plan to do this, I'll be honest, but I think the events of 2020 shifted our focus slightly to more of a well-being focus. And so we've been running these every 2 weeks for the last few months. Today, work-life harmony. Next time around, we'll be looking at resilience. There are really strong links between the two there. And later on, we'll be looking at psychological safety, which is a really important factor when considering team effectiveness and issues like errors at work, and performance improvement, trust, and also innovation. And each of the sessions is just 45 minutes long. And as I said, will be recorded and made available on YouTube afterwards. And you can find out all about these last few 2020 webinars at worklifepsych.com/webinars. So today we're going to be looking at the concept of work-life balance. And I put that in inverted commas for a very good reason, which I'll come back to a little bit later, and talk contextually about what could be making this difficult right now. Now, because of the diversity of people in this session, and I'm just making the assumption that there's people coming from very different roles, different organizations. I know for a fact some different countries. There's no checklist I'm going to give everyone that says do these things and everything will be fine. But there are some things that make it more difficult when we explore the interface between our professional selves and our personal selves. And this is often described as work-life balance, but as I'll elaborate in a moment, that's not a particularly helpful way of describing it. And I'll finish with some positive notes here. What is it that we can do at a sort of a tactical level to improve this for ourselves? And taking a step back, what are the things that we can bear in mind to make some more strategic changes to how we go about the different roles that we occupy in life? And that's a way of looking at all of this that I'd really encourage you to adopt. It's not about work and life. It's about the different roles that you occupy, each of which will demand different things of you, will require you potentially to be in different places, and will be associated with different people, different activities, and different values that you hold. So this idea of two things in tension is a little bit simplistic. And as most things are when we look at the world of workplace psychology, it's a little bit more complex than that. So what I would like you to do is to think about what you've tried before. When you think about this whole area of life, of your career, of your family responsibilities, of your social responsibilities, what have you tried in the past? How have you tried to improve the situation for yourself? Just take a moment to think about what you've actively done, because there is no one silver bullet here. There's no one size fits all solution for this. And I'm not critiquing anyone who has tried to improve the situation for themselves. Absolutely not. But often the sources for these attempts to improve the situation come from comparisons to others, sometimes unhelpful comparisons to maybe the rich and famous, or maybe a very clear one size fits all recommendation from a book. I want to avoid that, but I want you to think about your own context. What is it you do? Where do you do it? What are the demands placed on you? What kind of roles do you occupy? And with that in mind, how likely is it that those things would have succeeded anyway? So, from your perspective, what does it mean to you when you think about work life balance? What does that mean to you? And if you were to score it on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate it? And what are you going to improve it? What is it that's being done? Are you actively trying to make changes, or does this sit in one of those lists that's like, oh, someday maybe I'll get around to this? Frequently in coaching, this comes up as a topic. And the reason I ask this question is when I ask individuals, well, what does your work life balance ideally look like? They find it very hard to answer. So, if this represents a problem for you, one of the most important things to do is to identify what an ideal outcome could look like for you, at least to identify the direction of travel on the various issues that make it more difficult. But rather than it always sitting in the space of a problem or work life conflict or work family conflict, what might harmony look like? How might the different roles you occupy support each other, inform each other, mutually help each other? Because that's possible too. As we go through the rest of this, I'm going to recommend that you just firmly think about yourself, your responsibilities, roles, context, what life is like for you at the moment, to see how these different principles, how these different contexts are relevant to you and what's important to you. So let's talk about some fundamentals. I did allude to the fact that I'm not a fan of the phrase work-life balance, but I've kind of given up the fight on that. It's out there and it's one that everyone's using. But what I want to point out is that really it's not about balance. Balance implies 50-50, and balance implies stability. Balance is achieved, job done. And it's not like that at all, because, well, 2020 has really shone a light on that for all of us. Life changes. Our roles change, events around us have an impact on us. So looking for a stable balance is maybe not so realistic. And it's not work versus life. Work is part of life. And one thing that we as occupational psychologists know is that work is very important to us. We're either working or we're searching for work, but it can bring us a sense of purpose and meaning. So it's really not one against the other. I suggest it's more, how much does work play a role within life? How can it be accommodated alongside the other aspects that make you who you are? And there's a frequent focus on time management. That's fine. But it's not just about the time we spend doing things. Often we overestimate the control we have over time and our ability to meet deadlines and be places on time. But it's also about our presence. Are we actually there? And think about times when you've actually physically been somewhere, but you haven't psychologically been there. Your mind has been elsewhere, dwelling on the past, solving work based problems, thinking about tomorrow or next week. So, focusing on where you put your time is important, but to what extent do you put your focus, your presence, your attention? Where does that go? And it's not necessarily all about conflict. When we start the conversation about work life balance, it frequently starts with how work prevents us from enjoying our personal lives, or how the way our personal lives are set up really makes work more difficult for us. Now, for sure, that is one perspective that we can take. And it's as helpful to take the perspective about how these multiple roles influence and support and nurture each other. And finally, it can be as useful to think about how uh, our professional lives and our personal lives can be integrated. And instead of a permanent focus on either achieving balance or being stuck in a valley of problems, we can use the metaphor of navigation. How do we navigate the challenges that come up? And how do we do that in an ongoing way? It's a journey, to extend the metaphor a little bit. It's not an end point, it's not a goal as such. We don't achieve stability and balance that is not going to be taken away from us by the next event. So, have a think for a moment about some of the challenges that you face. What can make the interface between the professional and the personal a little bit tricky? What are the standout memories that you have, or the standout examples? And when you've identified one or more, feel free, drop it into the chat. I'd love to hear where you're coming from before I share some really common challenges that the literature has highlighted for us. So when you think about whatever it is that you do to achieve this work-life balance, what makes it difficult? So the first example there, thank you, from Brett, challenging thought patterns. This is really, really interesting that's the first one that you've identified. It's where I come in. It's where my focus is frequently, is around how we think about these things and how the thoughts lead to emotions and how emotions can influence our behavior in these situations. But it's a great place to start, taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and thinking about our own thinking. How realistic are we being? Anybody else got examples of challenges that you've identified for yourself, or you just know are out there for other people when it comes to this work-life balance conundrum? I'll push on, and I'll try and keep an eye to the chat as your thoughts come through. I'm conscious it can take a while to type these responses. Oh, well, thank you, Sarah. I'm working and doing a PhD part-time. Often I can feel guilty for not always working on my PhD. This is a great example. This isn't work versus home. This is work, paid work, versus development, learning, personal and professional growth. Two areas of responsibility, two roles that could be in tension with each other, but maybe not the traditional idea that we have of work-life balance, like getting home on time or not bringing work home. So thanks for sharing that, Sarah. There's a number of different ways that these can show up. We've mentioned one already: incompatible role demands. When it feels like we're being pulled in multiple directions because our job is requiring us to do one thing, and another role that we occupy, well, it requires us to do something at the same time, or it demands something of us that leaves us a little bit too tired to attend to the other role. And when those things, yes, Ella, thank you. When those demands come up at the last minute, that can really knock all of our plans for six. It can be difficult even when we've left one of these roles, one of these domains, let's say, to switch off from it. And people often think about switching off from work, but let's imagine the challenges are in the home environment. It can be difficult to switch off from those and focus on the workplace. Our working hours is our focus on where our time goes, but those can often be taken away from us. The choices about when we start and finish work because of upswells and workload, because of other people's absence and illness, from organizational changes, and as we've seen this year, from large scale changes that are affecting society. Now, work-life balance isn't the absence of long working hours, but it can be a really important symptom if you're working longer than you had ideally planned, and this thing can creep up on us. It may not happen suddenly. It can be a really good idea just to keep an eye on the hours you're putting into work to see, what do I actually do with my time when I'm at work? We can have some overspill from one role to another that's undesirable, and that could take many forms. That could be overspill of mood and emotion. I've had a bad day at work and I'm bringing that home with me, or it can work in the opposite direction. But it can also be the overspill that many people are feeling at the moment, almost a physical one of there are work objects around me constantly because I'm working at home. And in a moment, I'll explore some of the subset of home working challenges. But really, we feel uncomfortable when one domain impedes on the other. I want you to also remember that overspill can be positive. For example, skills we learn in one domain, we could use in another. Having a great day at work, we could bring that positive mood to when we go to, imagine in the old world, meeting friends after work. So overspill works in both directions, and it can be positive as well as negative or undesirable. A major problem that we've seen come up over the last few years is the role of technology. Technology facilitates flexibility. That's fantastic. However, it's also proving to be a large source of stress and really blurring whatever boundaries we wanted in place in between the professional and the personal. And whatever it is that we do with intent, whatever it is that we do consciously to manage our own resources, that can be difficult. And those resources are finite, like time, like attention, like energy. So a frequent challenge that's presented to me in a coaching session would be, giving so much time and so much energy to work that there's very little left for the other things that are apparently priorities, but they're not getting those. And that can leave us feeling very disappointed in ourselves and very negative about the role that work plays in our life. This is not a finite list, but it's to get you thinking about the extent to which these might apply to you as well. Now, when we think about homeworking specifically, and homeworking has exploded this year. For so many people, it's not been a choice. It's not been uh, a planned thing. It's just sort of happened really quickly. So a number of these challenges are popping up for people. But among them, the biggest of these is boundary management. How do we secure a boundary between work and non-work when work is taking place in the most non-work place ever, the home? And not everyone is finding that an easy task. When we're working from home, we also need to work hard at connection with other people. You may be sharing your home with lots of people, but you can still feel disconnected with the people that you work with. You may, in fact, be living alone and under restrictions such as lockdown and so on, feel quite disconnected from everybody. And just the absence of a commute can have a negative impact on our well-being. We may not be moving around as much. We may not be eating the same way that we would if we were going to and from a workplace. And so our physical and indeed our psychological health can take a dent from this kind of home working arrangement. And as we do know, people who work from home almost certainly will work longer hours than those people who are based in a shared work environment. So on top of the problems that we face trying to manage these different roles, we've also got these context specific ones of working at home. And this is possibly the number one issue that's coming up for me working with my clients this year is, it's great that I have a job. It's great that I'm busy and I have stuff to do. But really, after the initial novelty of working at home, that is wearing off. And there's several pain points showing. And they tend to fall in one or more of these buckets. So take a moment to think about the extent to which you're experiencing these. Maybe pick the one that's proving the most difficult for you and think about that as we go through some of the potential responses that you could use to improve the situation. And I say potential, as I said, there's no one size fits all, there's no silver bullet. It needs to be appropriate to your context and your personal arrangements. Let me pause here. Has anyone got any thoughts on any of the challenges that we've walked through, particularly the home working challenges? Do those resonate with you? Can you think of any others, ones that you've experienced yourself or others have shared with you? There's a lot of advantages to working from home when we want to, fewer when we have to, And if we don't do it consciously and in an organized way, we can have these problems creeping up before we know it, really. Okay, let me push on then. Now, we have lots of problems that I've outlined, but there's also things that we can do that contribute to these challenges that we can do ourselves. Um, Thanks for that, Claire. The novelty is definitely wearing off. Motivated and focus has plummeted. Absolutely. We've got finite amounts of just pure motivation to give to something. So I think by the end of this session, hopefully, look for something in there that you tactically could start to introduce, to experiment, to enable you to work on that focus. But things that we do ourselves to add to the messiness of all of this. First of all, we can over time drift from what's really important to us, our values. Now, if you've come to any of my webinars so far this year, you'll know I bang on about values all the time, but they're so important for helping us navigate difficult situations and persisting through that difficulty and that discomfort. And we can add to the challenges of the work-home interface by forgetting why we're doing it in the first place. We can also fall into the habit of striving, working super hard, getting stuck into a sprint almost as a kind of an unsustainable permanent mode. Many people did that at the beginning of this year. When it all got a bit difficult, many people dove into their work and worked really, really hard as if that would make the time pass faster. And of course, for most knowledge workers, at least, there's always more work to be done. It's not like we're getting to the bottom of the barrel. It's just instantly replenished for us. And if we're concerned about what other people think of us when we're not in the workplace, we may attempt to be always on, always available, always checking email, always checking instant messages to make sure we're seen to respond speedily, to make sure we're not missing out on something. And if we've got a core belief that we should be able to do it all, we're going to instantly fail and we're going to be disappointed in ourselves. And that can lead to all other kinds of problems. So one of the major things is to consider what's realistic, what's possible, to be pragmatic about this. And without paying attention to it, we may wake up one day and realize we have neglected some of the roles that were super important to us, and other roles have kind of ballooned and pushed them out of the way. And when we are finding it difficult, we may engage in some unhealthy coping strategies. For some people, that's working harder to get more satisfaction from the workplace or to get more reward from the workplace. For others, it might be the use of substances, it might be the use of food, it might just be spending hours and hours on social media rather than facing up to challenges. So there are challenges around us, and we can make them slightly worse for ourselves if these are some of the attitudes or the habits that we display. So let's have a fresh look at this. This is what I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks when drumming up interest in this, a fresh perspective. The first thing I'd like you to think about is what really matters to you. If we're going to navigate challenges, if we're going to look at what is important and put our limited resources into those things, then we really need to know what matters to us. Now, I ran a session a couple of months back around the value of values. If you take a look at that, it's on the YouTube channel. That will give you a really good insight into why values matter and how you can start to identify them. And if you're super interested in this topic, drop me an email and I'll send you a little worksheet on how to clarify those for you. A very simplified diagram here. But if we just look at the work domain, the aspects of life associated with work, I want to make the point using this that we've got multiple roles. Even within work, we occupy multiple roles. The formal role of your job, for example, but of course, you might then have the role of manager or team leader. You'll have the role of being a colleague to someone else. You might be a technical expert in an area. You might be the kind of person that takes on all of the social arrangements, those kinds of things. So even though you have a job, you will have multiple roles, and it takes a little bit of time to identify them all, but it is well worth it. And of course, the roles will place demands on you. You'll be involved in activities. So it's really useful to think about how those roles manifest in your life as activity. And what do they demand of you? Time and attention and energy. And this is so much more useful than just thinking about work. This is getting more specific, and that is a useful guideline when looking at this topic, full stop. And then we've got our personal domain, and the exact same applies here. The personal domain is everything that's not work, but we've already had a great example there from Sarah. This could include your continuing education. This will contain family roles, social roles, anything you do around your own well-being and fitness and exercise, your hobbies, your involvement in your community, all that stuff. So rather than I am a, well, no, you're multiple things. You have multiple roles and they demand things of you too. Even if they're your favorite role, they will place demands on you. So getting clarity is really important. Getting specific and then getting clarity. What belongs in each of these domains for you? How many roles do you actually occupy? And are you living them? Or would they exist only on paper? A little bit like for some of us, those gym memberships. Yes, we have them, we pay for them, we could call ourselves a gym member, but do we actually use them? And then, in all honesty, what time and what attention do you consciously devote to these activities? Is it like a slope where all of your time and attention is being inevitably drawn to some roles and some activities for whatever reason, and actually your desired spread isn't manifesting in your life at all? There's no quick win to this, and there's no start over where you flick a switch, but there is a starting point where you get clarity for yourself about how you'd like it to be. Now, there's a really important piece missing here on this super oversimplified diagram, and that's about boundary. The boundaries between the work and the personal. We really differ as individuals about how we like to treat that boundary. So one way of looking at it is how porous is it? Is it like a wall, a really high wall topped with barbed wire and searchlights? Or is it a bit more like a chain link fence where things can go through either side and it's not that much of a big deal? So you may have a generalized preference that you want to keep work and the personal really, really separate. And that's how you go into things. When I'm at work, I'm working. And when I'm not at work, I'm not working. And that's a totally legitimate preference. Or you may feel, well, when I'm at work, I'll take a personal call. And when I'm not at work, I'll keep an eye on my emails. That's fine too. But the most important thing is, are you doing it with intent? Are you doing it because that's what works for you? And also, does it represent a good fit for your context? Do you have a job where work can be done outside of work? And do you have the kind of personal domain where it's not too disruptive to allow it into the work domain? Think of the organizational culture where you are, and think about the kind of life you want to have outside of work. So being really consciously aware of how you like to manage the boundary between these two big parts and remembering that each of them will have multiple roles will give you an insight into maybe where some of your difficulties are originating. Let me pause there and check if anyone has any questions at this point. Hopefully this kind of resetting of the view makes sense to you. This is something I'd advocate that everyone sits down with some pen and paper and does, and I'll reiterate that at the end of this session. But it's not enough just to think about it. It's much more useful to write it out for yourself, to make it real on the page in front of you. So let's have a look at the big picture thoughts. I want to finish this session by looking at some positives, or I've just spotted something in the Q&A. What are some criteria to use to evaluate the poorest bit? So I guess there's no perfect list to that, Brett, but thank you for the question. So, the extent to which you are happy for work-based activities to take place outside of the work environment or working time, the extent to which you are happy for personal domain activities to happen during working time or in the work environment physically, the extent to which you're happy to think about the two domains while you're in the other one, maybe planning a holiday while at work in your mind, or mulling over preparing for a meeting or trying to solve a work-based problem while you're at home. The, the point about boundaries is that we establish these either through habit or they're established for us because of how we identify what's going on around us. And we pick up those habits based on what other people are doing. It can be really useful to establish it for ourselves, how I'd like it to be, and then move towards that rather than simply do what everyone else is doing, especially from a work environment perspective. And another point, Brett, is to look at maybe where you felt discomfort in the past, in how one is intruding on the other, in how work is intruding on the personal, or the personal is intruding on work. What form did that take? Was it time-based? Was it just the thinking about it? Was it physical objects like paperwork or a laptop? Or was it the emotion? So have a think about that. It can manifest in lots of different ways. I'm going to start with values because they are so important. So taking a step back and asking yourself what really matters to you. Go and have a look at the value of values video to get an insight into that. But that's a great starting point because that reminds you, this is what I stand for. Sit down with the pen and paper and clarify those roles and responsibilities. And then get really clear on the time and the attention and the focus that you invest in them. And would it be useful to make some adjustments there based on the values you ascribe to? And when you do this, be really clear that you're going to have to prioritize. If we agree that we cannot do everything, then some things will be undone. Maybe there are some roles that it's time to consign to history. Maybe there are some roles that you can turn down your attention on because other roles require more at the moment. So that's going to be uncomfortable. And a lot of the things that when we think about our values and we think about how we're living them or not, it's uncomfortable. But prioritizing here will mean that what you're focusing on will be doable, will be possible. And that's the benefit. And don't shy away from examples of one domain spilling into the other as some kind of failing. It can be uncomfortable, but really look at those examples and try and find both a root cause. Examine whether it was the disaster you maybe thought it was. Was it occasional? Is it something you can even control? And as a general principle, when looking at how you deal with demands placed upon you, and especially while you do it in 2020, act with compassion. Go easy on yourself and have compassion for those around you. And that's just about acknowledging humanity. We can all make mistakes and that we can all have a tough time of things. Don't apply rules to yourself. In fact, when we look at the work-life balance conundrum, it's less about rules and more about dynamic adaptation to changing circumstances. So rules really do not have a good place in any of this. And finally, look at your attempts to establish work-life harmony as an ongoing activity. And what that means in practice is a day where you've had to dedicate a lot of time to your work responsibilities, and therefore they take away from maybe social activities or family activities. That's not a failure. That's not you not having work-life harmony. That's a day. Now, if you have 35 of those days in a row, then maybe when that's not what you want, then that is problematic. But look at it in the longer term, across the week, the month, the year. Are things going in a direction that you value? And when they're not, what are the opportunities to reset and bring it back? And that would bring us right back up to the top of this list again. What do I stand for? What's important to me? What are my values that I want to follow? And to come back to a point mentioned much earlier on about thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts, and I put emotions in there as well. We want to use our values to guide our decisions, to guide our behavior, to be the person we want to be, rather than the flashes of emotion and the flashes of thoughts that are not always our friend. They're not always accurate. And that's another benefit to getting that clear. Now, this is a very strategic perspective. This is the sit back with a notebook, a pen, and a cup of coffee and work some of this stuff out so that you've got a starting point and you can see what's working for you and maybe identify where there's a level of incompatibility of demands, or, as is often the case for us, maybe we've neglected some roles. Maybe we're just giving them lip service, but we haven't really given them the time and attention that we'd ideally like to. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but it's almost inevitable, and it's not a failing on your part. This is an opportunity to reset. Let's look at some of the tactical things that we can do now, and then we'll have some time for additional questions, I hope. Boundary management can be made a lot easier, especially when we're working at home, by using some simple and welcome rituals to mark the start and the end of work. And it's important because for many of us, without some starting point and end point, well, we can never get to the end of work. And so the temptation can be to just continue working. If someone else isn't crying for our attention, then it means that we can easily just continue. When we are working at home and we've got other people around us, simple rituals for the start and the end of the working day also signify to other people, I'm at work now. I know you can see me. I know I haven't crossed town to go to an office, but I'm in work mode now. And they signal to you as well. Well, what is a ritual? Any simple activity that serves as a marker for you, not just a thought, but something you'll do. Sitting down with your favorite tea, reading the news, something like doing your yoga in the morning, going for a walk at the end of the working day, anything that is symbolic, that says, I do this to mean the end of the working day. And that's just not the point at which we want to collapse, because we also want to be able to engage with our personal activities with intent as well. And during the working day, and it's so easy if you are busy, and who isn't busy, or you're passionate or motivated by your work, it's very easy to get lost in it. So make sure that you schedule breaks through the working day. Make sure you have reminders, visual reminders, if nothing else, to say, take a break, stand up, walk around, have some water, get a break from this thing that you're doing. But also, this might seem very basic, if you're led by your calendar, if your calendar is very helpful to you, well, make sure you put in personal activities there as well to remind you there are things you want to do that are not work related, or indeed there are things you have to do that are not work related. And that can help you avoid the situation where the personal becomes a second-class citizen compared to the professional. Again, if you're working from home, you're not commuting. What could you do with the time you've saved? For many people, at least at the beginning of all of this, they sort of rolled out of bed, grabbed a coffee, and picked up their laptop. And you know what? That's great for their employer. They're getting 2, 3 extra hours out of them every day. Hurrah. But what about you? What could you do with that time? What could you do with that time that maybe allows you to focus on some other roles, allows you to focus on you and your well-being, allows you to take some of the time pressure off, the urgency of everything? We can be really clear on what we need to get done at work, our professional objectives. But think about the personal stuff as well, and not just think about it, but note it. Add it to somewhere where you can see it. It reminds you, I'm here to do more than the work I'm paid for. In my life, I'm also here to, it might be to address caring responsibilities. It's the chores you have to complete, the errands you have to run, the books you want to read, the TV shows you want to see, all of that stuff. Make it as clear and not the default that when all the work is done, then maybe I'll collapse in front of the TV. A really nice ritual, but it's a really nice process, especially when working at home, is to clear to neutral at the end of the day. And what that means is, rather than an alarm going off and you just dropping everything, you have a bit of a wind down period at the end of your working day, during which you're packing everything back the way you want to find it the following morning. If you find yourself working out of the kitchen, then you're putting all of the work-based stuff away neatly out of sight, so that the next morning you can start again in a way that you would like to, and not come into the kitchen to see paperwork and a laptop and all that other stuff, because we're very visual creatures and that can really draw us into work mode. But clearing to neutral room gives you an opportunity to also reflect on how the day has gone, make a few notes about what you want to do tomorrow. It's a nice ending that's within your control at the end of the working day. It's really important when working at home, but also when we're in an office from a work-life harmony perspective, full stop, to signpost your availability to others. When it's about carrying responsibilities, to let those people know your availability so that they don't feel they can't contact you because they don't want to disturb you, or that there are times when you're going to be out of contact with them. And also the expectations that you have and others have of you. And this is across your life, because this is a real bone of contention when it comes to people feeling that all of this is out of balance, right? But they also have failed to have had conversations to clarify expectations. And lots of this sounds like, I need to, my boss needs me to, you just have to, it's what's expected. But they've never had the conversation. They've never asked about the potential for flexibility. They've never asked about priorities. They've never spoken to people they're close to talk about the energy and the time they want to put into their career, and how their home life, their personal life can support that, and vice versa. It's not a one and done. These are ongoing conversations we need to have with those around us to minimize the chance of misunderstandings and to minimize the chance of role conflict so that we can have open lines of communication. But if you're working from home at the moment, be proactive in that. Don't imagine that no one wants to hear from you. Don't imagine that everyone's too busy to speak with you, because pretty much everyone thinks that from time to time. So proactively reach out and keep those conversations going. Remain connected. Let me wrap up with a couple of indications of next steps, and then let's open it to questions and thoughts. The one next step I really recommend everyone to do is sit down, work out the roles and responsibility piece, and look for any tension, overlap, or support between those roles. Have another look at the recording of this, if you can bear to hear it all again. But the advantage I always say to videos is you can fast forward through the bits you're not so interested in, but it's really useful rather than trying to remember everything that's been said. Have another look at that. And then do feel free to get in touch with your questions around all of this on Twitter. And if you do want to ask for a worksheet around clarification of values, you can email me, richard@worklifepsych.com. Right, let me open it up to questions or comments. Anything you'd like to know more about, or anything that you've found valuable or is a key takeaway from this short session on work-life harmony. As I said at the very outset, it's not a list of solutions that we've gone through today, but it's maybe a starting point. And if you think about it this way, you've taken 45 minutes out of your day to look into this. So it's meaningful to you. It's important to you. Don't now forget this as soon as we finish this session. Find that time to sit down and do this bit of reflective work for you, because it will benefit you and the people that are close to you. It will help you when it comes to your work roles. It will also help you when it comes to your non-work roles, and we'll find less of that striving for an unattainable balance and more of the ongoing work to navigate stuff and to see what kind of harmony that you can cultivate between your various roles. So any thoughts and questions before we wrap up this afternoon? Okay, let me quickly have a look at the chat. Right, the PhD is in mindfulness. I've been using mindfulness as a tool to help with well-being, concentration, and mindful breaks. Highly recommended, absolutely. The most recent episode of our podcast was all around the evidence for mindfulness interventions in the workplace. So do give it a listen if you'd like to hear about it. But there is good evidence. It's not a panacea, but it can be really useful. Useful reminders, had to force myself to close the chat and email to focus. Well, this is one of the things. Our habit of multitasking can make all of this a little bit more difficult. And that's a good example of the unintended consequences of having chat and email open or notifications going off while we're in non-work mode, and how that can take our attention away from the people we're close to, the people that are important to us, and take us miles away maybe months away in our minds. And as soon as we're doing that, we're not putting our time and attention into the role that we're currently occupying. So we've come to the end of our time slot for this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining me. It's been great to hear from you. The questions have been great. The commentary is great. Do stay in touch. We've got 2 more sessions this year. So go to worklifepsych.com/webinars to find out more about them and to reserve your place. And if you've got ideas for topics we could cover off next year, do get in touch. And I'd love to hear from you. Anything to do with the psychology of the workplace. All right. Thanks for joining me. Wishing you all a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.